Shall we start?
Yes.
Thank you. Hello, Professor Harman, and welcome. Finally, we meet. We have been scheduling this interview for quite a long time, and I'm happy to have you here today. It is my honor. You're a well-known figure in the parental alienation public in the world. However, since this interview is primarily for the general public in Croatia, the country where I live, I have the honor to introduce you. You are a relationship expert, researcher, and public speaker. You are Associate Professor of Psychology at the Colorado State University, USA. You have doctorate in social psychology, specialization in the study of intimate relationships. You have 2 master's degrees from Teachers College, Columbia University in psychological counseling, and you served as a family and substance abuse counselor for several years prior to entry into academia. You're a well-known researcher. You have numerous research papers and articles on the subjects of relationships and parental alienation. You're author of several books on relationships and PA, such as The Science of Relationships, Answers to Your Questions About Dating, Marriage, and Family. That one I need. And Parents Acting Badly, How Institutions and Society Promote the Alienation of Children from Their Loving Families. You are a lecturer throughout the world through PA conferences, workshops, and seminars. You are Simply Parents Director. It is well-known American NGO about parental alienation and alienated parents. You are well-known TED Talk speaker on the issue of parental alienation. Your talk in 2016 got 150,000 views so far. And you are an expert subject matter witness. That is something I would like to clarify at the end of the interview. Have I missed something? Would you like to add to the list?
I'm also today president of the International Council on Shared Parenting as well. So
Bravo.
That's new.
Bravo. I didn't detect that through the internet. Okay, my name is Jasmina Radulj. You can call me Yasmin or JR, whatever you prefer. I'm an alienated mother of 2 wonderful boys. Now they're teenagers. I've been alienated from them for years. I'm also owner of 2 web pages and blogs on parental alienation. One is called Life with Alienated Children. It is in Croatian, for the Croatian public, describing what parental alienation is. It is about the educational and empirical side of parental alienation, while my blog itself, it is about emotional side of the story. The other web page recently opened is Parental Alienation Healing. It is in English. It is about how to thrive from parental alienation. Yes, that is possible. It is about the spiritual side of the parental alienation. What I wanted to talk to you today is about parental alienation as a form of domestic violence, as well as child abuse, but the focus will be on domestic violence. And first of all, I want to say that parental alienation in general is not recognized in Croatia as a phenomenon. But what is more important is that in the circles of experts who are aware of parental alienation, or who know what parental alienation is, parental alienation is predominantly seen as only child abuse, for which both parents are equally guilty. They don't recognize parental alienation as a domestic violence. So my definition of parental alienation on my webpage is as following. Parental alienation is a consequence of family violence done by one parent against the other parent through psychological abuse, psychological manipulation of their children. Repercussions of psychological abuse, manipulation, are that children emotionally and then physically reject the other parents once their beloved parent. The abusive, alienating parent aims at only one thing: to exterminate, remove, erase the other parent from the lives of those children. The abusive and alienating parent does this systematically, continuously, deliberately, and above all targeted. There are two victims of this act: the abused, alienated, targeted parent, and the children. There is only one abuser, the alienating parent, the parent who abuses. Psychological abuse of children through the process of parental alienation is a crime. As such, it must be prosecuted by official institutions and authorities. So, Professor Harman, what is parental alienation?
So the definition of parental alienation is that it's an outcome in a child of a family dynamic where the child aligns with one parent and simultaneously rejects the other parent for reasons that are not legitimate. So these reasons could be fabricated or false or exaggerated, things that kids would normally forgive a parent for because no one's perfect. And so what we're talking about with alienation is an outcome in the child. And the primary cause of that outcome are behaviors of the parent that they've aligned with. And those behaviors serve to make the child believe that the other parent never loved them, abandoned them, and is unsafe. And so they engage in many, many different types of behaviors to make that happen. And they often use other people like therapists, teachers, police, other people to help with that, or neighbors and friends, extended family like grandparents and other people to help do that. Yes. And to push this other parent out. You're right in when you were describing the definition, is that it is a form of domestic violence. And in my work, we find that it's the type of domestic violence that it is coercively controlling abuse, or otherwise known as intimate terrorism, otherwise known as battery. But it's the psychological variety. But sometimes there's still physical abuse as well. And we don't so far find gender differences in who the perpetrator is, because a large number of the behaviors are it's psychological abuse. And when we look at national statistics across different countries, men and women perpetrate psychological abuse at similar levels. And so it's not a gendered thing, despite what a lot of detractors try to say, that it's just something that abusive dads do to get custody and, or say that they're doing. But moms are alienated too, and dads. So it's both. And so, when we look at the actual statistics and the research evidence on the topic, we find that it is more like coercively controlling abuse than other kinds of family problems or conflicts or violence. You can contrast it with the situational couple violence, or common couple violence is another term for it. And that's a very different kind of conflict with parents or two people, because they're not using violence or aggression as a means to control or dominate the other person, right? They're using usually aggression like throwing things, pushing, arguing as a way to try to fight, right? It's different. In fact, that kind of abuse is more common than what we're talking about with coercively controlling abuse. And coercively controlling abuse, all the research on that shows that, or a lot of the research, when they look at how these people use behaviors to control and dominate the other person, they often use children as weapons to do it.
Yes.
Right? They threaten the other parent, saying, if you leave this relationship, you'll never see your children again. I'm going to tell your children how much you hate them and how awful you are. And they use the children as weapons as a way to control the other person. Now, a lot of domestic violence researchers stop there. They don't look at what impact that has on the child to be a weapon. What happens to that kid? And so that's where scientists like myself step in to look at what happens to these children when they're used in that way. And that's why we call those behaviors parental alienating behaviors. But they are the same behaviors as coercive controlling abuse. It's the same thing, just with a different name. And the reason we give it a different name is because of how we look at how it affects children, right? And so that's where the body of research on parental alienation focuses, is these behaviors that a very abusive person uses to turn a child against a parent that is good enough and is a loving, caring person, right? And nobody's perfect, but kids need to learn that. They need to know that their parents aren't perfect, because nobody is, right? But alienators will, they will do everything they can to punish, hurt, erase the other parent from that child's life.
So it is about psychological profile of such abuser. Can you tell us a little bit more? Because it is not about gender, it is not about religion, it is not about race, it is not about nationality. It is about psychological profile of the abuser. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, we don't find, this does not discriminate against, you don't find, for example, people who have a lot more money alienate more, or higher education. We don't find differences in that. When we haven't looked at it in Croatia, but we looked at a representative sample of adults in the United States and Canada, and we don't find differences on all those demographic variables, which is similar to what we find with other kinds of domestic violence. It doesn't discriminate, right? You could be, you can find it among any kind of socioeconomic or demographic group. But what we do know about coercive controlling abusers is that they tend to have unresolved trauma. They have often personality disorders because of that trauma that make it hard for them to understand other people's perspectives. Their needs have to come first because they are, damaged in a lot of ways. That's why they try to control everyone around them, right? They have a lot of psychological needs that are very difficult to treat when it gets that bad. And we find that for batterers, right? And we find the same things, the same types of disorders that batterers have. We find the same things in parents who alienate their children. And so that's further evidence that that's the kind of violence we're talking about. And we also find that children who've been alienated, there are some telltale signs that they have that make them different than kids who've been abused in other ways. But they still also manifest the types of outcomes that we see in kids who've been abused in other ways. So kids who've been victims of child abuse or severe maltreatment. These children have anxiety and depression. Not all of them though. Not all kids who who are abused have all of those, but when they do, it can be very devastating. A lot of them have very severe psychological problems because of the abuse that they undergo.
What about the victim, the alienated parent, the target parent? What about his psychological profile and the damage he's suffering?
We don't know a lot about their psychological profile. We do know that they're not as pathological and whatnot as as they're made up to be by the alienator. We do know it has long-term effects on them that are negative because they're victims of violence, right? They're victims of domestic violence for long periods of time, even when they leave the relationship. a lot of times people leave relationships because they're not healthy, which is good. But then when they have children, their children are used to continue to dominate them and control them. So it's like they never left the relationship, right? They never are able to get away from the abuse.
I think that is very good comment. Sorry to interrupt, because when you are in such a relationship and you want to get out, you are in a fight or flight mode. You just, you are in such a stress. But once you go out, you think, okay, now I'm fine. I'm going to the court. I'm going to fight for my child. And then actually the real parental alienation hits. And then you are actually in the second round of your trauma. And that is when actually the trauma of parental alienation starts. And it's nothing compared to that. Whatever you had before, it is one story, but with parental alienation, it is really a deep, deep trauma.
Right. Yeah, we find that there's been several studies published over the last probably 2 years looking at the impact on targeted parents. Yeah, we do find that, or alienated parents is another word. We use the terms, both terms. But we find that they're, have a lot of anxiety, depression, traumatic, well, I don't like to use the word post-traumatic symptoms because it's not post, it's ongoing. It's not like you lived through a war and you're dealing with the ramifications of it. You're in a constant state of trauma and re-traumatization. I have parents, every time they get the police knock on the door or their phone rings and it's an anonymous call, meaning it could be from the police, they panic. They just, because they're in a constant state of defense and attacks. And so the trauma is real and it's ongoing. It's not, something that has ended and they're continuing to relive. They're reliving it every day. And so a lot of parents become suicidal. I published a paper where we found that for those parents who are moderately to severely alienated from at least one child, almost half had thought of suicide in the last year. Mandy Mathewson and her colleagues found that in their sample, like about 3% or so had tried to kill themselves in the last year. And so it's very traumatic for the parent who has lost a child. And then, and so, and I think one thing that's really important to understand is that for the child, they are grieving too. I mean, to lose a parent who's a primary attachment, this is a primary person in their life, and they are not allowed to grieve it.
Yes.
They have to act like you didn't exist at all. And we know from other areas of research that when people don't resolve grief, how that affects them. Like if they lose a sibling, if children lose a sibling and they don't grieve it, we know that they suffer all sorts of negative consequences. They externalize behaviors like they have ADHD or attention deficit disorder, it looks like on the outside, because they're so traumatized. They're trying to avoid the pain of that loss. And so this is why when you see kids saying they're terrified of you, they hate you, they never want to see you, they're telling everybody all these horrible things about you because they're not acknowledging the grief or the loss of you. They're trying to avoid it. Yes. Right? But by avoiding it, it's the elephant in the room. It's always there. And so they're always on alert to prove to everybody how much they hate you, to suppress the feelings of loss.
And love. It is contrary to what we target parents feel. We grieve for our children as if they are dead. And that is something what the general public audience or even experts cannot understand, that it is such a loss that we feel as if our children are dead, even though, of course, they are alive. But that is really a good comparison when we are showing our grief and children who cannot do that. Please continue.
Yeah. I mean, they're in a position where, I mean, what if they do acknowledge it? You know, it's hard because they've been manipulated to believe that you don't love them or that you abandon them, and they don't get information anywhere else that contradicts that information. And so, you know, the parent who's alienating a child, they're much like cult leaders or other types of alienators, what we call predatory alienators, where they change the reality of that child's, they get them to adopt their reality. And then the child is unable to have their needs met by that parent because that parent is so oftentimes obsessed with erasing the other parent. They have their own psychological problems, so it's hard for them to meet the needs of their children. So the children learn that the only way they can get that parent's attention is to please them and to meet their needs. So the child in that situation is in a no-win situation. Like they feel like they've lost this parent, who they feel rejected by this parent, even though they were never rejected by them. They feel as if they were. So they're hurt and angry. And no matter what that parent does, that child will not see that they love them. Like they can't see it because the other parent has changed the way that they view them. I just published a paper 2 months ago where we talk about that as a corruption of reality. They corrupt the reality of the child, where their experiences with you as a parent are essentially, they're told that they never happened or that it was wrong. You know, that person never loved you, right? Look what they did, and they were never there for you. Look, they forgot this. They forgot your, you know, your football game or whatever, even though you were never told about it, right? And the child hears this and they say, yeah, you're right. Even though their experience with you in the past was different. And so the child starts to not trust their own memories. They don't trust their feelings, and they start to disconnect from them. And then that affects every part of their life.
Absolutely.
Because now they can't connect or trust their experiences anymore. And so their voice, you know, a lot of people talk about you have to hear the voice of the child, and the child doesn't want to see you. Well, if the child's been manipulated, you know, then how could you trust that voice? You know, it's like terrorists who've manipulated children to hate others and kill themselves, you know, in suicide bombs. Really, you're going to say trust the voice of the child when they've been manipulated to have those thoughts and take those actions? I mean, that's a dramatic example, but this is a dramatic example too. Children who are severely alienated, that is,
they are hostages. They are definitely hostages.
Yeah, there's a great book by Stanley Klawar and I forgot the first name, Rivlin is the second author. And they have a book called Children Held Hostage, because that's what it is. They believe, you know, they've been brainwashed to believe all these things that haven't happened, just like a member of a cult is brainwashed. And so the kids, and it takes a long time to get them to, if you can get them away from them, just like a cult member, it takes a long time to, you know, deprogram somebody. You know, a lot of cult members, it takes them a really long time to start to see what happened to them. And same thing with children who are able to somehow get out of the dynamic when they're older. If you can intervene earlier, it's a lot easier when they're younger. But as they get older, it's more difficult, and that young adult usually really struggles with their loss of innocence that they have. Like their whole childhood is really gone. You know, they're often treated like adults by the parent who's alienating them. They tell them things that they shouldn't know, you know, as a child. So it destroys their childhood. You know, so because they're left, you know, like my parents divorced. I don't know the reasons why. And I'm not ever going to ask. I don't want to know. Right. You know, but alienators will tell those kids everything, you know, that they should know, you know, and they're doing it on purpose to try to make that child angry at you and give them a reason to push you away and to make them feel like you are horrible and shouldn't be in their life.
When we talk about the reasons, can you tell us a little bit more about the difference between parental alienation and estrangement? Because in Croatia, I think that is very important to actually say and speak about it, because our parents are seen as equally guilty.
Yes. So estrangement is when a child's rejecting a parent for legitimate reasons, which would be things like severe abuse, you know, maltreatment, maybe verbal abuse, you know, telling the kids how horrible they are and, you know, that they're making them feel shame and physically harming them. But what's interesting is that actually estrangement's actually not that common, because most kids who are maltreated or abused don't reject the person who's abusing them.
No.
Dr. Amy Baker has published 2 studies where one of them was with foster care children. So children who've been taken away from very abusive parents and put into foster homes. And they were asked, you know, well, what do you want most, right? What do you want to do? And they were surveyed and asked about how they viewed these parents that abused them. And they all wanted, most of them, almost all of them, I think it was like over 90%, wanted to go home. They don't hate them. In fact, they even minimized the abuse that those parents did to them. There was another study that they published about 3 or 4 years ago where they, or no, today's 2021, so about 3 years ago, they surveyed child protection workers. So these are people who investigate abuse, and they asked them to look at their caseloads of all the children who were very severely abused and had them describe or kind of rate the child's behaviors towards those parents. Now, these people were not told what the study was about. They were just asked to rate how these children behave towards them. And what they found is that the vast majority, I mean, overwhelming majority of these children engaged in behaviors that were designed to try to increase their attachment or repair the attachment to them. They weren't engaging in behaviors to destroy the attachment, meaning avoiding contact, saying, I never want to see them.
Bravo.
So for kids who are estranged, usually they're a little bit older, like where they've had some perspective on the abuse that they lived through, and they realize, wow, that wasn't good. It's healthier for me to be away from this parent. But that takes a little bit of time away, right? And some, or some intervention when they're younger to really see that this isn't healthy for you. But usually those children do not have the hatred towards that parent. They're upset, they're hurt, but they still love them. And they often feel very ambivalent towards them, right? They understand that they have problems, like maybe they have substance abuse problems. Maybe they have a mental health issue that makes them legitimately afraid of them sometimes. But usually those children also recognize that they're not dangerous all the time and that they still love them when they're healthy and safe or when they're better. So this is a big difference between alienated children and estranged children. Estranged children don't reject the parent the same way. They might waver a lot. They might not want to see them because they're legitimately concerned and afraid, but they still long for them. They acknowledge the good in them as well as the bad. They even minimize the bad. Alienated children don't do that. Okay. Now, if we step back and go back to when we talk about what kind of abuse parental alienating behaviors are, aka otherwise known as coercively controlling abuse. Coercively controlling abuse is not something that two people of the same amount of power do to each other. It's one person dominating and trying to control the other person. And what motivates them is power. And when they feel like they're losing power, they do lots of things to get more of it, including using the children, making allegations of abuse against the parent, doing all sorts of things to try to maintain power. And they get power by having the children's allegiance or loyalty. And so like they can get money, they get decision making, they get all sorts of stuff by having the kids in their pocket, right? They have their kids, so they have them. And then after a while, they don't need to do anything. The kids take over. And that's when it gets in the severe stages of alienation. And not all children become alienated, which is good. That's a good sign that some kids are somehow resilient and can, there's a lot, and we know that, sometimes we know that like parenting time with the other parent helps to mitigate some of the abuse because the children have some alternative experiences with you that go against what the parent's trying to tell them. We know that, sometimes kids just, maybe there was a lot of positive relationship with, or a really good relationship with the alienated parent before the divorce or separation. So that helps them buffer what's going on. And they kind of play along, but they don't really believe a lot of the stuff that's going on. So there's some kids who can weather it. But if the parents are engaging in what we would call like situational couple violence, where, they're just using aggression as a way to, end an argument, right? Or something like that. Sometimes those parents will try to bring the children into that fight, right? And that's a different dynamic. That is a dynamic where both parents are fighting with each other. They disagree on, I don't know, whether the kid should play football or something. I don't know. It could be something. They disagree. They don't agree on maybe, or if there should be a surgery or something should happen. And they get into arguments and they bring they try to have the kid pick their side. That's very different because the children haven't rejected a parent. They don't like to be involved in the conflict, but they're being sucked into it by the parents. That's what we call a loyalty conflict or a loyalty bind. And that is when both parents are just as bad. Like both parents are doing it. And what we see in those situations is those kids, they don't want anything to do with it. Like they just get frustrated. They just like, leave me out of this, because they want to just live their life and be a kid, yes. Right? They don't want to deal with their parents' drama. And so they will distance themselves from both parents. But it won't be a rejection. It'll be more of a hands, like, leave me alone. And in that case, both parents are responsible. But not parental alienation, because parental alienation involves one person doing a lot of this. Now, what happens in court, or if you're involved with a therapist who doesn't understand parental alienation, alienated parents don't always react well to what's happening. I mean, how could you, right? And nobody's perfect. And if you are being told that you're lying and you're not, or if the kids are screaming at you and you have no authority and you try to take their phone away to discipline them or something, now you're abusing them. And I mean, it's a living hell for a lot of parents, right? And so nobody copes well with that. It is so stressful. I mean, that's why we see suicide, anxiety, depression. And so, but then that's used against the parent, just like we see with battery. Historically, a lot of women who are battered go to court and they look like a total mess, right? They look like they have lost it. They're unfit to be with their kids because they are just not coping well. But that doesn't mean that they're just as responsible for what's going on, right?
It's the normal reaction to trauma.
Yeah, they're being traumatized. And there are cases where the parent is so traumatized. I've seen courts where they finally recognize that alienation happened and it was bad. And the other parent is so traumatized that they are actually not able to get the kids back. And it's not because, and they recognize that it's not their fault, but the children wouldn't be good in both homes. And so they've taken the children and sometimes put them with a grandparent or who was not involved with the alienation, or even in foster care, because they realize that the psychological abuse is so bad, but yet the other parent is not in a place where they can receive them and be a good parent because they've been so traumatized. And those are the really tragic cases, because it's gone on so long that everybody's just damaged because of it, you know. And so yeah, so that happens, sadly, you know, more than you'd like it to, you know, to happen. But yeah, so I think it's, you know, trying to understand that when a parent, and I testified in a lot of cases where the lawyer or attorney representing the alienating parent will point to one thing that the alienated parent did and say, look, they're doing it too. And I have to educate the court and say, no, one behavior does not make it an alienating behavior. It might mean that one parent's just acting badly or responding badly to it because they don't have any other choice. And that's another thing to recognize is alienators, because they're trying to get power, just like coercively controlling people, the way that they do it is to minimize choice of their victims. They minimize their options, because the more options they have, the more power they have, right? So their whole goal is to make it where you only have two choices. So a lot of their behaviors are designed to force one of two possible responses. And they're both bad. So let's, like, as an example, let's say you go to a parent-teacher conference at your child's school, and that parent runs up to you in the hallway and starts yelling at you, you know, accusing you of something in front of the children and in front of everybody in the hallway. What do? So you have two choices, only two choices. You engage or you walk away.
Right.
If you walk away, everybody thinks that they were probably right. You know, that they're accusing you of something and no one questions it. If you stand up to them, they say you're being aggressive and that you're argumentative and that you are just as responsible for the conflict. But people don't realize that if you look at the types of situations over time that are created by these parents, and you look at what choice did this parent really have in that situation, it becomes more clear whether you're dealing with a coercively controlling person or not.
Yes, absolutely.
And so that's, you know, I usually have to inform the courts, or especially attorneys who are working with families, is go through the whole history of the case, every behavior. If there's an interaction that they're trying to use against you, show what led up to that interaction. Don't take anything out of context, because that's how you show coercive controlling abuse. You have to show the whole pattern. And that's how you show the power dynamics and the pattern of abuse. So.
Abuse is not happening just one. It is systematically, right, continuously, and deliberately.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, with situational couple violence, you see it's not predictable, right? It's just something comes up, both parents are upset about it. They don't like what the other person did. They pick a fight with them. You know, a good example would be like one parent has rules in their house that the other parent doesn't like. You know, sometimes you'll see parents fighting over that, but that's different. That is not, that is not parental alienation. That is just two people acting badly and, you know, making the kid be messenger between them and, you know, putting them in the middle. And that's not good. But that's not the same as when you're looking at patterns of abuse, you know. And so, you know, to be an alienating behavior, the definition is patterns of abusive behaviors over time. Right. And they're unilaterally done for the most part, or they're proactively done by one person. And so when you look at what the other parent's doing, they might still be doing behaviors, but they wouldn't meet that definition. Because you wouldn't see them done, you would see them often done in reaction to what's happening. Absolutely. It wouldn't be something that they are initiating on their own.
That is something what is happening at the Croatian courts, and that is that the judges would say that there are plenty of hybrid cases in the parental alienation, that both parents are equally guilty, and that is the hybrid case of parental alienation, when actually they do not recognize the reaction of the targeted parent who is on constant attack from the right. alienating parent. And if you are on constant right. attack from somebody else, you are right. human. You cannot, you know, you cannot survive that.
Right.
So thank you very
much. And when
we
talk about hybrid cases are different. I mean, hybrid cases, the real definition of those is where a parent does have problems, right? You know, like, so the alienated parent did behave in ways that would possibly be reason for rejection. So let's say a parent has, you know, like, let's say they were abusive in some way, or neglectful, or had a substance abuse, and they did it when they were, you know, drunk or something. And now that parent, yeah, and then now that parent has gotten sober, right? They've gotten treatment. Now their life is better, but the other parent is using that against them to turn them against, you know, to exaggerate and show that this parent is still unsafe, even though they're not unsafe anymore. That's a hybrid case. So a lot of times, though, they will misuse that word to say, oh, look, this parent's reacting negatively back, so they're abusive too, right? And that's not the same. That's not the same at all. That's a complete misuse of the term.
That is correct.
Hybrid is very different. I mean, we're talking there about a parent who does have problems and needs, like, you know, here in the US, we have courts called dependency courts, where it's different than family court. It's different than criminal court. It's courts where there's been abuse, and child protection services and other people are in front of a judge. It's treated like criminal court a little bit, but it's specialty courts for abuse. And in those cases, those are cases where you have a parent sometimes who had some real problems, but did everything that they were supposed to do, right? They took all the classes, they participated in groups for a year to address their problems. They have no drugs in their system for 2 years. They have stable housing, stable employment, and they've determined that this parent is safe and with support can start to see their children again. But alienating parents will say, no, nothing they can do is good enough. Like, and so they set up these roadblocks to make it impossible for that parent to go back to having a relationship with the children. And those are difficult, those are complex cases because the children may have legitimate concerns about their safety, but those can be handled in therapy. Those can be handled in counseling and reunification therapy. But if it's being undermined by the other parent, that's a hybrid case, right? That is a case where the alienating behaviors need it because the child's being abused on both sides at that point. Even though one parent who initially was abusive is now better, and is under supervision and is considered safe, the other parent is engaging in abusive behaviors to stop that. That's hybrid. And we only find in a study that I published a few months ago, we found that only about 20% of cases actually meet that definition. And those cases actually, that's being generous, because we said if there was any finding of abuse, and sometimes those findings are later determined to be not true, like when it goes to court. But if there's any finding of abuse, we said that sure, this might be a hybrid case, but it's only like 1/5 of cases.
Okay, of parental alienation cases or divorce cases?
Hybrid cases.
Okay.
That would be considered hybrids, right? Where one parent really did have a problem or had some abuse claim, and the other person was alienating the child. That's only like less than 1/5 of the cases actually met that definition.
All right.
And so now in terms of, I did do a study of a representative sample of adults in the United States to see, in the third poll that we did, we looked at parents, people who had a child with someone that they were not in a relationship with anymore. Okay, so some people were never married, but they still had children together, but they're not together. And in that sample, about 50% of families were either had no violence or no conflict, or they were both engaging in behaviors, right? So that would be a loyalty conflict, about half of those. About 37% of that sample, this is over 600 people, but about 30% of that sample, 37 or 38%, were what we would consider an alienation case, where the parent, well, not all their children were alienated, but about 37% of them were parents who were dealing with alienating behaviors of another person, and they were not responding and not reciprocating them. So that tells you the proportion. So sometimes I testified in a case this last week where a judge asked me, for a long time, nobody knew about alienation. And then all of a sudden, alienation was everywhere. And now, what is it? Is it everywhere? Is it, what is it? And I had to say, well, now there's been a lot of scientific advances in the last few years, and we know a lot more about alienation. And we know more about how it's different than other kinds of conflict. And so it isn't in every case, right? You can have 37% of divorce or cases where the parent is dealing with these behaviors, but only a small percentage of the children actually get really severely alienated. So that's good. Unfortunately, I'm only involved in cases that actually go to court and they're really bad, right? But there's a lot of cases out there where the kids are they're still alienated and they still struggle. I mean, even moderate. When we say moderate alienation, it doesn't mean it's not bad. It just means it hasn't gotten worse yet. It's still really bad. I mean, even mild is really bad. It's like, I know some people don't like the terminology regarding, it's like cancer, but it is. It's like an illness that if you don't stop it, just like other kinds of child abuse, it'll get worse. You have to prevent it from getting worse. So
Speaking about the courts, parental alienation is a new human right, and everybody knows, or it will know very soon, that it is very damaging, and that the only way how you can actually gain back your child is through the court, if we are talking about severe parental alienation, and if we are talking about personality disordered alienating parent. So there will be more and more cases like that. And it's not just that the target parents will go to the court to fight for their children. Very soon, adult children, so the grown-up people who survived parental alienation in the childhood, will start going to the court and maybe suing their parents for that. Well, and as well, grandparents will go to the court to see their grandchildren. So there will be more and more parental alienation cases at the court. That is how life is, and I'm very grateful actually for the opportunity that we can go to the court, because I am an alienated child, and my father 40 years ago couldn't even dream to go to the court and explain what was happening. So thank you very much, Professor Harman, for being with us in this world of parental alienation and actually explaining to the judges and to the lawyers and to the rest of the world what parental alienation is and how damaging it is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hopefully people like me won't be needed, and everybody will know someday what it is. In Canada, a few months ago, the court took judicial notice of alienation as child abuse. And what that means is, it's amazing, because what that means is the court said, you don't need to have an expert come in here and tell me that it's child abuse anymore.
Bravo.
Just show me that it's happening in this case, and we will treat it like child abuse.
Bravo.
That's huge.
Bravo. That's everything. That's everything.
Because I have to spend, most of my time really explaining to courts, what is alienation, what isn't it, how can you tell the difference, and I explain the scientific evidence behind that and why what you would expect if it was a different kind of family conflict or not. I have to explain you don't need a psychologist to diagnose it. You don't need that. A court can look at a kid and say, you're being abused, and do something about it. You don't need a psychologist to evaluate that child and say, you've been abused, right?
No.
I always have to explain that to the court, and my role is hopefully to just give them the tools that they need so that they can look at the evidence and decide for themselves, is this the case or not? And so that's what I do. There are other professionals who do more, they look at specifics of the case and they will describe to the court. And so, kind of the best, most effective approaches I've seen so far have been where if you don't have a court that understands it, you have somebody who can educate them on it.
Yeah.
And then you have therapists or other people who've worked directly with the children and describing what they've seen. They don't have to have an opinion about alienation or not, but they would describe what the kids are doing and what the parents are doing. And then you have a good attorney who can connect the dots of your case to the testimony that someone like me gives.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you describe what the court should look at, and then your lawyer presents the evidence needed to tie directly to it. And then you kind of explain to the court, if it was actually a loyalty conflict where you're both responsible, or if it was estrangement, here's what you would expect to see. And we don't see that here.
Bravo.
Right? Here's what we see. And what we see is consistent with what the research says about parental alienation. And so that tends to be very effective. And in fact, I've testified in a lot of cases where that helped the court really see and recognize what it is. They don't always like to do what they should do to stop it. but they will at least, you know, do something to they'll at least recognize it.
What I would like to say is actually that it takes personal courage of a judge to decide on such case, and actually his responsibility
Right.
to go into that direction. It is much easier to actually put up front the experts and their expertise, and then don't know what to do with it.
Right, right. Yeah, and what I will often have to, you know, I go through, there's a fantastic book, if anybody doesn't have it, this is going to be backwards, but it's Parental Alienation, Science and Law. It's edited by Lorandos and Burnett. And there's a fantastic chapter in it written by Dr. Rick Warshak. And he reviews the evidence and best practices for treatment at different stages of alienation. So in mild cases, you have more choices of what to do. As it gets more severe child abuse, you have to take more invasive kind of structured approaches to treatment. And I just published a paper, it just accepted last week on Friday, so it hasn't appeared in print yet, but we described that, that child protection responses just vary based on how severe the abuse is. And the same thing happens for parental alienation. It depends on how bad it is and how amenable the alienating parent is to change. If they're able to recognize the impact and get counseling and therapy to stop, and then you have more choices of intervention. You don't have to take the child away because the parent's willing to stop what they're doing, right? And then they can promote a relationship with coaching and support. But if that parent starts to violate that and continue to engage in behaviors and is unable to stop doing it, then you have to take more drastic action because it's going to hurt the children long run.
Who would do such therapy for the alienating parent?
You need to have somebody who is very good at working with people who've had trauma or personality disorders. Unfortunately, we know that really severe alienators oftentimes have antisocial personality disorders, which makes it nearly impossible to treat. If it was just pure narcissism or just pure borderline personality, it's hard to treat, but it's not impossible. But if you have a parent who feels like they're above the law, that they aren't doing anything, they don't care about the impact of their behaviors on other people, that's really hard to treat. So usually the therapeutic approach in those cases involves a lot of psychoeducation. You know, you're not going to maybe change the deep-rooted problems of that parent, but a therapist who is working with that parent will make very clear the expectations of the court of if they continue these behaviors, they will lose custody, right? They make it very clear that you will not get your custody back, right, if you continue to do X, Y, and Z. And they try to kind of make it very clear through education the types of things that they can do instead of what they've been doing. But I know that, for example, the Family Bridges program, which was a program developed for severely alienated children, Dr. Yvonne Parnell created the aftercare protocol for alienating parents to try to help them get the help they need so that they don't reoffend the behavior. And what they found is that these parents, therapy does not work on them because they don't think that they've done anything wrong at all. So that in fact, the therapy kind of made it worse, like it didn't help at all. So they had to change their approach and use more psychoeducation and make very clear expectations about their behaviors and what will happen if they continue to engage in those behaviors again.
So,
but those outcomes, they're sadly not that different from what we see with batterers. Batterer intervention programs for people who are severe batterers is really challenging, and it's not, the success rates are not that high.
I don't think we have either of the programs, so I don't know what to say. But who would be in charge of actually controlling the outcome of such therapy, or if the other alienating parent is really going to the therapy?
So what is recommended in this book that I showed you is, a lot of parents can't afford the interventions that I was mentioning. And those interventions, like Family Bridges program or Turning Points for Families program, they're not designed for long-term care. They're only designed to start the process of reunification. But the program itself can't happen unless there's court orders and strong kind of plans working with the court on progress and updates. And so in this way, it's a lot like